You think you'd never do it. You think if a stranger screamed in pain on the other side of a wall, you'd stop immediately, no matter who told you to keep going. 2 out of 3 people didn't stop. Not bad people, not sadists. Regular guys recruited off a newspaper ad who kept pressing a button they believed was shocking a man to death because someone in a lab coat calmly told them to continue. That's the Milgram obedience experiment. For over 60 years, it's been the go-to explanation for the Holocaust, for war crimes, for basically every atrocity ordinary people have ever committed under orders. But newly surfaced original audio tapes revealed the most famous number in psychology wasn't measuring what everyone thinks it was measuring, and the real reason people obeyed is stranger and honestly more useful to know than the myth. Stick around, because by the end of this, you will understand obedience in a way that textbook headline never captured. Let's start with the legend. It's 1961 at Yale University. Stanley Milgram, a young psychologist, recruits ordinary men from New Haven through a newspaper ad for a study on memory and learning. Each participant is assigned the role of teacher. Another man, actually an actor, is strapped into a chair in the next room as the learner. The teacher's job is simple: read word pairs, and every time the learner gets one wrong, deliver an electric shock, each one stronger than the last. The shock generator has switches labeled all the way up to 450 volts, with the final 2 switches simply marked XXX. The learner, of course, is never actually shocked, but the teacher doesn't know that. As the voltage climbs, the actor in the other room starts to grunt, then yell, then bang on the wall, then go completely silent. Whenever a participant hesitates, a man in a grey lab coat, the experimenter, delivers one of 4 scripted prods. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. Milgram's results stunned the field. 65% of participants went all the way to 450 volts. Every single one of them showed visible distress, sweating, stuttering, nervous laughter, but the majority kept pressing the button anyway. The conclusion became one of the most famous findings in psychology. Ordinary people, given legitimate authority and a small enough push, will inflict serious harm on a total stranger. Milgram published this as direct insight into how the Holocaust happened. Ordinary people just following orders. It became the default explanation for atrocity for the next 6 decades. Here's the first crack. In 2007, psychologist Gina Perry got access to Milgram's original archived audio recordings at Yale, tapes almost nobody had listened to since the 1960s. What she heard didn't match the clean 4-line script at all. The real experimenter went far beyond the approved prods. On tape, he's heard badgering hesitant participants, improvising guilt trips, repeating pressure over a dozen times in a single session, sometimes for minutes, well past the point the published methodology described. The clean, standardized 4-prod script that's taught in every textbook wasn't what people actually experienced in that room. It gets stranger. In Milgram's own post-experiment survey, a huge chunk of participants said they weren't fully convinced the shocks were real in the first place. Some estimates put the number who suspected the whole thing was staged as high as half, and the people who doubted it was real were significantly more likely to go all the way to 450 volts because, obviously, if nobody's actually getting hurt, obeying costs you nothing, which means a meaningful chunk of that famous 65% wasn't obedience to authority at all. It was people making a reasonable guess that a university wouldn't actually let them electrocute a stranger and acting accordingly. Then there's the number itself. 65% isn't the result of the Milgram experiment, it's the result of one specific version of it. Milgram ran more than 20 variations, and the obedience rate swung wildly depending on tiny changes to the setup. Put the learner in the same room as the teacher instead of behind a wall, obedience drops to 40%. Make the teacher physically hold the learner's hand onto the shock plate, it drops to 30%. Add a second teacher who refuses to continue partway through, obedience collapses to 10%. Move the experiment off Yale's campus into a nondescript office building, it drops sharply too. So the honest number isn't 65%, it's somewhere between 10 and 65, entirely depending on context, which is a completely different finding than the one that made it into the headlines. So does that mean the Milgram experiment is fake? No, and this is the part worth sitting with. The core effect that authority can push ordinary people into causing harm replicates. Researchers have run modified, ethically adjusted versions of this study as recently as 2009, and people still obey at meaningfully high rates. The effect is real. What's wrong is the story wrapped around it, the idea of one fixed number describing human nature, delivered by a script nobody actually followed, to participants half of whom weren't fully convinced it was even real. So what's actually driving obedience if it's this sensitive to context? Psychologists point to a few ingredients working together. The first is legitimacy. People obey authority they perceive as legitimate. A Yale scientist in a lab coat reads as legitimate. A random office building does not. The second is gradual escalation. Nobody starts at 450 volts. You start at 15, then 30, then 45. Each step a small, easy justification for the last one. By the time you're at 300 volts, you've already told yourself the first 19 steps were fine, so why stop now? The third is distance, both physical and moral. The further you are from directly seeing the harm you're causing, and the more that harm is being ordered by someone else who says they'll take responsibility, the easier it is to keep going. And the fourth, the one the audio tapes reveal most clearly, is social pressure in the room itself, not a script, an actual person actively pushing back on your hesitation in real time. Which gives us a genuinely useful and much less fatalistic takeaway than humans are secretly willing to torture strangers. Obedience isn't a fixed trait waiting to be unlocked. It's a dial, and the dial is moved by how legitimate the authority looks, how gradual the escalation is, how far you are from the consequences, and whether anyone else in the room is willing to say no. Which means the single most effective tool against harmful obedience isn't individual moral strength. It's exactly what dropped compliance to 10% in Milgram's own data, one other person in the room saying, "I'm not doing this." Dissent is contagious, and it works better than conscience alone. If you're noticing the pattern by now, a famous psychology finding, a much messier reality once you check the original tapes, and a lesson that's actually more specific and more useful than the myth. That's this whole series. Next time on the study files, we're looking at the marshmallow test and the incredibly obvious variable everyone forgot to control for that quietly undid one of the most famous findings about willpower and kids. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and let me know in the comments, honestly, do you think you'd have stopped at 150 volts?